I've been in Houston for almost 40 years, starting at Rice and now practicing architecture. It's always been focusing on the design of the city and the design in the city, either as an architect or as a client. And so my community service really focuses around the power of design, which is a moniker we have at Gensler for whom I work. But the idea is the city has evolved tremendously in 40 years, and part of that, I would argue, and maybe I helped with, has been the education of both the design leaders, the community leaders, and just the general community through things like a symposium and other events. So my leadership is involved sort of educating the larger public as well as the experts or the young professionals who will shape the city into the really vibrant place that it is through things like Site Magazine, the Rice Design Alliance, to the fact that I've taught at both University of Houston and Rice for almost 24 years. Really interesting stories about people who I meet who are now young leaders working for the mayor who are former students of mine. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I saw the city leaders, the Pennsylvania leaders in the 50s and 60s really take or grapple with how to make the city livable, because it was a steel city. It was full of pollution. It was a place that arguably you only came to because you had to work there. And I saw really in my growing up a complete turnaround in probably less than 20 years where the recognition of the quality of life was connected to the quality of the environment. Still employment, and of course that was the era too of the steel and a lot of the other industries changing. What inspired me were the leaders who weren't necessarily the rich men or the politicians. It was the sort of the servant leadership I saw in all kinds of community leaders that were thinking about, what do I do to leave a legacy? Whether it's teaching, whether it's community leadership. The idea is that I come from a family, my grandfather was a great inspiration to me, because even though he was a textile manufacturer in a little town in North Texas, he gave back to this little city by being on the council and the head of the school board and looking at, even for Sherman, Texas, planning their city center. And that said, you know, outside of your everyday 9 to 5, how you make a living, and my advantage is it's actually, as you noted, tied into that, everyone can make a difference in a city. So that leadership, whether you see our current mayor, Mayor White before that, et cetera, those folks, Mayor Lanier, they did what they did because they were successful in their business, and they brought that to the larger community need, which that give back, that contribution, those people who do that are very inspiring to me. And Houston, you know, from its very beginning has really been, in, you know, very much part of that kind of thinking. And as, you know, the great leaders like the Browns and the Cullens and all those have gone on, there's been new generations. And I think, you know, the diversity and the scale that is Houston now, each one of us can take those kind of inspirations and do our little part to move the city forward. One of the big things that came about in my time in Houston, particularly working for the University of Texas Health Science Center, is this connection of sustainability to the durability and resilience of our city. Also the idea, more recently, we're sort of getting our arms around the notion of well-being. We spend 90% of our time inside our buildings. So in fact, the health of the city is as much how we build our buildings, how we maintain and take care of the buildings. So a lot of what my community focus has been is trying to work with everyone from the two mayors and their offices, with some of the AIA and other sort of affiliations of professionals, to groups like the Rice Design Alliance, various organizations that spring up to help with visioning of the city's future. It's all about strategic planning. I mean, why I'm of course interested in the Center for Houston's Future. It's all about futurism and the strategies, and sometimes down to the tactics of individual approaches, of looking forward to understand ways that we might, through some scenario planning, really develop some very good ideas for the future and lay the groundwork. So I might say that the community focus I've had has really been trying to get people to understand, whether they're design young professionals, whether they're leaders in the community, my clients at various energy companies and technology companies and universities, to really start thinking about cause and effect as it relates to what they do in their small focus. All those incremental great decisions can add up to a vibrant city, a vibrant region that will make it a very healthful place to live, as well as a very attractive place to live. So really it's been interesting, from our growth of mass transit and the green spaces and a lot of the thinking that the mayor and other of our energy companies and of course the Houston Partnership, Urban Land Institute, all of which at some point I've hopefully had a little bit of connection with, thinking about sustainability not in the sense of just hugging trees, which I do hug trees, but the reality is really thinking about the life cycle approach to making a better place that uses resources like a passion I have, water, a lot better because we're recognizing the value of those natural resources and the value of the people in our city who really depend on those kind of resources. So that education, that service, that sort of strategic thinking, looking at the future has been something I've been very passionate about for really since I got out of school way back in the 70s. Of course, there's nothing like networking and meeting new people and meeting and really seeing. I'll give credit to the center's focus. Diversity of Houston is what we're all about. We're no longer white Anglo-Saxon old guys. That's me. But the fact is the diversity of the city, the diversity of our leaders, the diversity of the great ideas can only come about when we break down some of those I don't know what the right word is, synthetic barriers. You know, we are a city of diversity, but we're also a city of some segregation, not purposefully, but just where people live and choosing to live outside the loop, inside the loop. Neighborhoods, you know, assimilate by virtue of like-minded people. I live in the Heights, which I think is terrific because there is quite the diversity of neighbors and neighborhood. So in fact, the forum was an interesting way to create a mini neighborhood of people that, you know, like your neighbors, you might see once in a blue moon and say, hi, John, hi, Sally, how are you? And make some connections that then synergize for the everyday. Sometimes it takes weeks and months and whatever for it to connect. From the exercise, you know, my focus on water, I've connected pretty directly with what some of the initiatives in the mayor's office. I've been part of Mayor Parker's water task force, which is still sort of working through things. That's then led me to work further with Laura Spangen, who of course is our sustainability officer in the city. In the meantime, too, there's been engineers who, of course, would like to work with Gensler, so that's allowed some opening of opportunities for them. The diversity of insight from, say, a banker who's suddenly recognizing we have food deserts and sort of connecting them or being part of that connection or synergies that come from networking. I think the other or second component that's really nifty is that it starts to look at some things that perhaps aren't even on the radar screen and could range from, I mentioned the food desert, to human trafficking, things that adversely impact the future of our city. And it's not just introducing those ideas, but it's really seeing how they start to connect. The forum forced you to cluster them, you know, so that we're not, I guess the old adage is we scatter shot and therefore we don't really affect change. But if there's some clustering, there's some synergies in looking at resources, human capital resources, people's great ideas, rather than dispersing it across so many different and, yes, pressing challenges, but start looking at synergies, which the forum encourages through its leadership and through its discussions. There's a real value to that. Now, you know, I will say we launched a few things that didn't go anywhere. Some of them are what we call phantom initiatives. They're still alive, but we're not quite sure how long. Maybe zombie initiatives is another phrase they use. But there's a lot of the groundwork laid for, I think, some really energetic and opportunistic, positively, future thinking among the folks who met each other. And of course, the alumni, that's great because I've run into all kinds of colleagues who said, oh, you were with the forum too? When were you there? And we think we should have like a lapel pin that says, you know, the secret sort of notion that, you know, I went through this great event and I was 2 years, you were 4 years, you know, so the idea is that there might be some connection, so, you know, sorority, fraternal kind of thinking that might really, back to that networking, allow us to move forward given the commonality of experience. I have been teaching sustainability and how buildings work and community planning, and again, I tend to have a very broad focus, so I'm often in the process, I'm the front-end strategist or big picture thinker before the client says, I want yellow. And then I have the experts who know yellow, if you will. But in teaching these various curriculum, I've been doing it long enough that as someone teased me the other day, he says, you now have grandkids. Now, ostensibly, had I had children, you know, early, I could have been a real grandfather. But the idea is I now have people who I've taught who have become teachers, who have taught other young leaders that are now in places like the mayor's office or in leadership in other cities or leading research organizations in places like Austin. So the fun thing is running across at various conferences and conventions, you know, sort of one right after the other, people who I have maybe touched or made think in a different way, not just in Dallas, Houston, or Texas, but also across the country. And they're all trying to make, as we talked about earlier, that positive impact. So it's, for instance, David Robinson, who's running for one of the elected offices, was one of my TAs and students. So the fact is, I think the issue is I'm seeing people with whom I probably had some great experiences, who, you know, particularly early in my teaching career, were part of my formation, who are now very much creating this synergy and positive outlook and planning and thinking for the future for our city, if not our region. So I run into a lot of folks with whom I've had the pleasure of connecting and teaching, and not sage on the stage, but collaboration. And so that collaboration with the next generation of leaders is probably my sort of high point when I look at who's running the city now and in the future. The recognition, as my wife teases me, is something I sort of have always thought, well, that's for other folks. You know, I need to do what I need to do, not distracted by adulation or anything like that. But being recognized by a group particularly like this is very, very honoring. And I must say that I'll be certainly pleased for whoever wins the nomination, because, you know, all the people that have gone through the forum and worked for the Center for Houston's Future are our leaders, and, you know, we should give team awards rather than one person award. But thank you for the nomination, and I very much appreciate just having the opportunity to visit.